Hello and welcome. You're tuned in to the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. That's Tim Dennis. And this is an interesting week for us, Tim.
Yeah, it is.
Aside from what's going on in the world around us, we've got a fun guest that's joining us. He was with us on True Crime Tuesday. If you missed that episode, shame on you. Go subscribe. It's a damn good show. You guys should be listening to it. But we've got our guest back. Not the same topic. Whole new topic. That's how versatile this guy is. Been a friend of our show for going on 14 years, and he is back. He's got a book out called A Song of Dance and Death, Magic, Murder, Mayhem, and the Diabolical Notes of the Devil's Music. This book came out in April 2019. We have a link up for that book on today's program, so you can find it directly, and a link right to Troy Taylor's website. One of the best paranormal authors out there, folks. You are locked up. You've got 3 to 4 weeks to yourself. Get yourself a Kindle version of one of these books or order one of the books and read them. Keep yourself entertained, occupied, and enlightened. Troy Taylor, welcome back to the program, sir.
Hey, good to be here, as always.
Yeah, so listen, music is going to be one of my go-tos during this time of solace, right? I'm planning on forcing my children to expand their horizons outside of what they think is music at this point
You
in
have
history.
a captive audience.
Yes, and we're going to start going through the musical catalogs of some of the greatest 80s one-hit wonders and rock and roll legends on the planet. But I just thought it'd be great, too, in this case, to kind of hear some of the stories and backstories behind some of the history of these songs, music, and you know, there's been so much said about the devil's music and rock and roll ushered in. And for, you know, a lot of people think it's the rock and roll era that kind of ushered in the devil's music. It starts long before that, doesn't it, Troy?
Yeah. That was one of the things I wanted to do with this is I looked at all of these different versions of things that people called the devil's music, dating all the way back to the Middle Ages, with certain notes, you know, that were not allowed to be played in churches and things because it was thought that it might summon the devil. You might recognize one of the notes because it's, you know, the really cool part of Purple Haze by Jimi Hendrix. That's the note. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. That tritone note is what the church did not allow to be played in churches. And so, you know, that was the beginning of the devil's music. But I mean, it's had a million variations over the years.
So do you think at some point somebody was shaking their fist saying, oh, these kids and their Gregorian chant music?
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Oh,
so, yeah, so it's been around forever. I mean, it's you know, it started then and it just keeps going.
Well, what made these tritone notes? Was it just something that was offensive to the ear? So they just decided it must be of the devil?
No, this is even better. There's actually a space. There's a certain space within those notes that it's believed that pause was open for the devil to insert himself into the music. I'm not kidding. But I mean, you got to look at the time period, you know, I mean, we're looking at where the devil was everywhere back then. You know, people could only do things on certain days. They could only, you know, eat certain things. Women and men, you know, that were married could only have sex on certain days. And I mean, there was, you know, it didn't leave a lot of room because it could be. Yeah, you heard me.
Has that changed?
Well, yeah, I've heard it has. That's the rumor that's out there. It would be like, well, you couldn't do it within so many days of, you know, a certain holiday or a certain prayer day. And by the time you got done with it, there were like, you know, 8 days out of the month that were okay, if even that. So it was, there's a lot of crazy stuff.
8 days,
that's how
this
stuff got started. Yeah, but that's when it was.
Game.
Yeah, that's when it was allowed. I didn't say that's when it happened.
Oh.
You know? Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. You know, you mentioned that there's this space in the music where they feel the devil could enter. I went to a Christian grade school, and we had a dance, and I remember them telling us to leave room for Jesus between us.
Right.
And I'm like, you know, let him get his own date. You know, if
exactly.
God is not good enough on your resume to get you some action, I don't know what is. But Yeah, that's funny. So they thought in these notes. So was it like a musical invitation, and it would open that, if you would, portal to allow the devil to influence?
I'm not even sure they were thinking that far ahead. I mean, this was just one of those unnecessary rules that popped up at a time when people were, hanging and burning witches at the stake. So, I mean, it really didn't take a lot to come up with something crazy. But those were the first Devil's Notes. And then, around that time, as we kind of progressed further on, there were certain songs that were believed to be satanic that couldn't be played. There were certain musicians who, rumor had it, had deals with the devil. I mean, and this was all still in the years of the, Enlightenment and things like that, before we even get up to, the jazz era, which of course was devil's music, or the blues, which again, devil's music. And then, after that, it was rock and roll. So, but yeah, it traces sort of a history in between, that was the plan with the book. And then of course it, as most of my books do, I go down rabbit holes and spiral out of control on curses and things. So, but the initial plan was that, yes.
Well, I know there's a documentary called The Crossroads on Netflix that I just started about Robert Johnson.
Yeah.
This is always kind of an interesting story to start with. This is a blues man. And as I understand from even just watching the first 10 minutes, this was a blues man who is not really that talented a musician. And then something bizarre takes place.
Yeah.
Legend.
Yeah. Well, it's, and it's interesting because you can read 10 different books about Robert Johnson, and while they might all contain an allusion to this story, some of them will swear it's not true. Some of them will swear it is true. But it is, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest blues legend and really the introduction to rock and roll legend there is. This Robert Johnson was just this young guy who had started playing, trying to play the blues, wasn't very good at it, literally got booed off the stage. And then he left, shows up again 9 months later and starts playing again. And now the crowd was said to be just chilled and spooked by the transformation between how he'd been 9 months before. Well, legend had it that he had gone out to a crossroads on Highway 61 in Mississippi one night and then had sold his soul to the devil in exchange for talent and a handful of songs. And he became famous very quickly. And the legend has it he was haunted in his dreams that the devil was after him, that was chasing him down a dirt road. And he did a lot of songs like Me and the Devil Blues, Hellhound on My Trail, and of course Crossroads Blues, which is the most famous version, which has been covered by a whole bunch of different bands. And then in the book, I actually trace how many bands that covered Crossroad Blues had terrible things happen to them. So there is actually a curse not only on Robert Johnson, but on the song Crossroads Blues too. But anyway, the devil said, or the story goes that the devil only allowed Robert Johnson to live until he was 27. And there are a couple of different versions of how he died, but most of them seem to agree that he was poisoned by a club owner who suspected him of seducing his wife. So he was buried in an unmarked grave in one of the local cemeteries, and there are actually two different cemeteries that claim to have Robert Johnson buried there. That's how good his stories are. But that story with the blues then turning into rock and roll is one of the things that has made, rock and roll and, the devil, completely connected after all these years. I mean, that's where the idea of the devil's music and rock and roll being the devil's music came from. And it's all been connected to this over the years. So, but that's how it got started. I mean, the Robert Johnson story is a very cool story, whether you believe in, curses or deals with the devil or anything else. It's still a pretty cool story. So,
well, are we able to trace back the mythos of this deal with the devil? Was it something he admitted to? I would guess that'd be something he wouldn't be real forthcoming.
Well, I wouldn't think so either. And that's been kind of the debate on it, is people say, oh, well, he never said this, or, and they will tell you, and I documented this in the book, that he did have a teacher who supposedly taught him the blues during that 9 months. But then, of course, there are lots of stories around that too, claiming that, you know, this teacher was someone that no one could find. There were, you know, taught him how to play in a graveyard. I mean, it's all this kinds of stuff. And it really boiled down to the fact that he was I guess a white Jewish man that taught him how to play. His name was Ike Zimmerman, which is an odd name for a blues man, but that's the story. But Robert did claim that he learned to play the guitar at night in old churchyards. And of course, then, you know, the story still went that Zimmerman was, of course, the devil in disguise. I mean, it was just whatever people wanted to believe about this story is really what it comes down to. Mm-hmm. And so it made a great story about a blues man. It's the perfect story. That's the perfect rock and roll legend of how it all begins, that it couldn't have just been a guy who really discovered his inner talent. He had to have gotten this from the devil. And so all of the music was then, you know, inoculated with, you know, demonic forces, I guess you would say, at least to people who believe in that sort of thing. So,
and the last name was Zimmerman, just like Bob Dylan's.
Bob Dylan, right?
Which would make complete sense on how he got so popular.
Yeah. So who knows? I know it's just one of those things, but it's. I love the story. Even people who want to just dismiss it and say, "Oh no, that, you know, nothing like that ever happened." And I'm not sitting here trying to convince people that Robert Johnson made a deal with the devil at the crossroads. But that story's become so ingrained in our lore, and you know, stories of deals with the devil at the crossroads, man, go back hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, that's a really common thing, not only in Europe, but it was a big part of, you know, local lore in the Deep South at the time, you know, that you could go to the crossroads and make a deal. And that's, you know, what they said Robert Johnson did. And, you know, it probably got started by some saying something, how'd this guy get so good? Oh, well, you know, it probably sold his soul to the devil, you know, and off we went. So, but it's still a great story.
Well, now you kind of tempted us here with the aspect of his song being kind of cursed and how it's affected other people. So can you give us a little bit of that background as well?
Sure. Yeah. A big part of the book became about curses and about, you know, music curses, especially the Buddy Holly curse is a big one. The Grand Ole Opry curse is another big one. And there's been a lot of little ones too, but the Crossroad Blues song, you know, first of all, it's made famous by the guy who started the original founder of the 27 Club, which is a really infamous curse that is a lot bigger than people realize. There have been a lot more singers died at 27 than just the top 5 that we all think about, you know, and well, I'm sure we'll get to that because you can't not talk about these curses and leave it out. But one of the first groups that's said to have been affected, especially by the Crossroad Blues curse, were the Allman Brothers. They made that song famous for the first time after Robert Johnson, and they had a lot of tragedy. You know, Duane Allman was killed in a motorcycle accident when he was only 24. And then to make things worse, you know, another band member died in a motorcycle accident almost at the exact same intersection where Duane had died. So that was bad enough. But Barry Oakley, that was who died. He died at almost the same spot. And there were quite a few other things that happened to the band that, you know, went on over time. About the different members were killed, different bad things happened to them. Eric Clapton is probably, with Cream's, probably the most famous, most recent version of Crossroad Blues. And while he's still alive, I think we can say that he's had his more than fair share of bad luck over the years with drug addictions. And of course, his son that fell from the window of the hotel and died. George Harrison, you know, was a good friend of his. They got into problems with, you know, between Patty Boyd, and that was who, you know, some of his songs were about, and they ended up, you know, I mean, a lot of bad things happened to him too. I mean, I think the worst of it would be his son dying. But there were others. There were a few other people who also got involved in the curse, and that story, did kind of keep being told when it came to Crossroad Blues. They say that the story goes that one of the last victims of the curse and who also was part of the 27 Club, who was working on an acoustic version of Crossroad Blues shortly before he died, was Kurt Cobain. And whether or not you want to tie that into the Crossroad Blues curse or you want to tie it into the 27 Club, it's bad either way. So you've got bad things happening with this song, and there's a lot more detail in the book, but it's just one of those stories. Rock and roll and musicians are a superstitious bunch, I will tell you that. So there's a lot of good stories out there.
Do the bands themselves look at these songs and look at them as being cursed, or has it always been something they just kind of roll their eyes at and ignore?
It varies. There are a lot of people who roll their eyes at this, and honestly, in the book, I roll my eyes at a lot of it because some of it's not. Some of it is supposed to be a curse, and I kind of just go, well, if you want to believe in the curse, there it is, But so yeah, I think it goes both ways. For a long time, the way that people would harass Led Zeppelin about their alleged deal with the devil, and they would get angry about it, But on the other hand, here's Jimmy Page with this gigantic occult collection. So I think it goes, back and forth and all over the place. I think it depends a lot on what's popular and what's of interest at the time. In the late 60s and early 70s, and through the 70s, it was really cool to be, linked to something satanic. It was cool for your image, just like some of the hairband people, in the early 80s. You had Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. It looked really cool to be linked to this stuff. But if you ask them about it, they go, oh, no, I don't want anything to do with that stuff. This is just our image. So I think it really is all over the place. But some of the curses I found that they do gain their believers. The Grand Ole Opry curse was a really particular one. The Grand Ole Opry, and I know it's not rock and roll, but it was such a famous curse, and there's so many people that crossed over between the two that you could really mix it up. But the Grand Ole Opry, the curse seemed to be more connected to people who performed at the building, because the original Ryman Auditorium, because the Grand Ole Opry is pretty much wherever you want to put it on. It's moved to several different buildings over the years, but it seemed that those who performed at the Ryman were the ones who seemed to be most affected by it. And we're talking about, Hank Williams, who died tragically, who was there in the early days of the Grand Ole Opry. Johnny Horton, the guy that sang the Battle in New Orleans song, died in a tragic automobile accident. Patsy Cline, we know how she died. She died in a plane crash, and she was very connected to the Opry, of course. There was a good friend of hers, Jack Anglin, who was killed on his way to her funeral, was also a performer at the Opry. Quite a few people: Texas Ruby, Agnes Owen, Jim Reeves. All of these people died under very tragic circumstances. And yes, you could put that off and say, well, you're talking about a bunch of people that were, at the golden era of country music, who were living a pretty hard, fast life, and so is it really a surprise that Hank Williams drank himself to death and died in his car? But then you get people like, String Bean Aikman from Hee Haw, who was just this country boy who'd made good playing the banjo, and people loved him. And then he was murdered when some guys broke into his house to rob him. So, you just don't know, what was going to be next. And a lot of these people were not people that you would expect to have died under very violent circumstances. And yet there was a whole string of them. And in the 70s, which really the curse kind of came to an end in the 70s when the Opry moved out to Opryland, and kind of the Ryman stopped being used for the Grand Ole Opry. But people were talking about the curse. That there are a lot of quotes in the book from music stars and things that talked about all the bad luck that was happening to people who played the Opry. So it really varies. It depends on the artist. It depends on the circumstances and the situation, I think.
Now, I'm sorry, did you explain why did they think the Grand Ole Opry was so
No
cursed?
idea. That's no idea. That's the thing about all these curses. that I found that nobody really seems to know how or why they got started. I mean, you can start with Buddy Holly. I mean, here's a guy who had a very successful career and, but then died young with the Big Bopper and Richie Valens in a plane crash. And it seems like everyone connected to Buddy in one way or another after that. There were performers that he had helped get started. There were guys who used to tour with him or were close friends who suddenly ended up having a big string of bad luck, like Eddie Cochran. I mean, Eddie was in a terrible car accident with Gene Vincent. I mean, these were two guys that were like the beginning of, rock and roll with Buddy Holly. They were really big. And, Eddie died the next morning after this car crash that he was in, after finding out that Buddy had died. A lot of the guys that were playing in the Crickets, who had been his backup band, several of them, one of them died in a plane crash. Another one died in a car accident. I mean, it was just like one thing after another with these people that were connected. Bobby Fuller, who Buddy's parents had helped get started with his career, was murdered in Hollywood after moving out to California, and his murder's never been solved. And so there were a lot of people that were connected in some way to Billy. Some very, and that's where the curse gets a little silly, in my opinion. There are a number of people who, are associated with the curse, but only because they were, went to a movie about Buddy Holly or, but they were musicians. So the story got started. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you kind of have to take with a big grain of salt. Or, there was, and Ricky Nelson, who died in a plane crash, also, got started around the same time as Buddy. And there were a lot of connections between him and Buddy Holly. But the big thing is that this is where people like to connect him to, is that his last recordings were covers of Buddy Holly songs. And then the night he died on December 30th of 85, the last song he played at his show was Buddy Holly's Rave On, and got on the plane and it crashed. So, I mean, it's a little bit of a stretch. Del Shannon, too. He was Del Shannon, which, most people remember from, they know like Runaway and some of his songs and stuff. But he was a friend of Buddy's. He started out around the same time, and he was actually touring with a tribute show to Buddy Holly. At the time, it was, bringing back some of the old rockers, and they were bringing them back. And this was in 1990, I believe. Yeah. And the last place that he played was the Surf Ballroom on February 3rd of 1990, the last place Buddy Holly played, the anniversary of Buddy Holly's death. And the last song he played was a Buddy Holly song, and his backup band that night was the Reunited Crickets that had played with Buddy Holly. So that one is not so much, but he didn't die in an accident. He committed suicide, but it was right after that. So that's kind of where they, draw the line between Del Shannon and the Buddy Holly curse. And the really bad thing about Del Shannon is that at that time they were going to ask him to take Roy Orbison's place in the Traveling Wilburys, because Roy Orbison had just passed away, and Del had been without a job for years. He was doing this revival thing to try to pay the bills, and that would have been his chance to really take off again, hopefully, because that was a pretty popular band in the early 90s.
Yeah, it was.
And then he, not knowing anything about it, committed suicide right before he was asked to join the band. So it's a sad story. It's a tragic story. How it links to Buddy Holly, there's a lot of weird little coincidences there, but that's the nature of these curses, though. These music curses are a lot of coincidences, and the only time you really kind of start to think, and I don't know if you take them super seriously or not, but once you get into the stories about the 27 Club, that's a lot of people to die at the exact same age.
That is.
Again, though, you got to look at the majority of these people died under circumstances that were not exactly, yes, they were tragic, but they weren't accidents for the most part.
Right.
Most of them were self-imposed deaths.
You're living those hard lives, drinking, taking drugs, driving fast, staying up late, going to bed, getting up early, exhaustion, just wearing down their immune system. So, it's not, but it's weird that it's at the age exactly of 27. That's the really screwed up thing. I was going to mention to you, we actually were doing a show oh boy, about 8 years ago, live on our former radio station. And Rick Nelson's pilot called us.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Do you remember that, Tim?
I do, yes.
Yeah, he listens to the show and called in and answered some questions for us on that, because there was a lot surrounding the death of Rick Nelson. He was freebasing cocaine, it exploded, it was all this, and this guy said it all straight. He's like, no, it was a crappy heater on the plane. He had complained about it, and he was one of the only. I think he and the other guy are the only two that survived the plane accident. He crawled out through the front window, but said just what a lovely guy Rick Nelson was. But yeah, you look at. Now, obviously, he far outlived the age of 27 and,
Sure.
but died in a tragedy. Before we get into the 27 club, though, if you look at how many celebrities die in plane accidents or helicopter accidents, that to me seems like, listen, I understand those things happen, but the stunning and staggering amount of celebrities, especially in the musical genre, that have died in aircraft related incidents, that's pretty bizarre as well.
It is. And really, but on the other hand, you can look at it and say, well, here are people who are traveling by plane a lot more often than your average person. So, I mean, their percentages are going to go up, but still, I mean, especially when you go back and you think about having, three of the biggest pop stars at the time, Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Richie Valens, all in the same plane and dying at the same time at the height of their career, and all of them had premonitions of an early death. I don't know. A lot of people don't realize that, but Buddy's wife used to dream about him dying in an airplane, and he laughed it off. The Big Bopper had premonitions of dying by plane, and Richie Valens was terrified of flying because, if you've seen the movie, if you've seen La Bamba, and even if you haven't read anything about Richie, he was supposed to be at school one day when a plane went down over his school and killed his best friend. And his friend Richie would have been killed too if he had been there, but his best friend died. And so he was terrified of flying and would do anything not to have to fly. And so their entire tour that winter had been by bus. But the weather had gotten so bad and the heater was broken on the bus and they were all sick. They had colds. And so finally they're like, we've got to get some rest. And so we're going to take this flight. And I'm sure you know the story about, one of the musicians that was playing in Buddy's band was Waylon Jennings, who lost the coin toss and to another guy. And so he wasn't on the plane because he'd lost the coin toss. So he talked about that a lot, as you can imagine, as the years went by. So, planes are bad.
I wonder how much survivor's guilt he had to deal with.
No kidding.
Feeling that. And not only that, but then, you've got, wasn't it Stevie Ray Vaughan who died in a helicopter accident, I think, after leaving Poplar Creek Amphitheater in Illinois.
Right. He got tied into the Crossroad Blues curse. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Dean Martin's son, and a lot of people forget this, but Dean Martin's son was a musician in the 60s. He died in a plane accident, crashing into the side of a mountain. Yeah.
I didn't know. Wow.
Yeah, his son, that's pretty much what kind of sent Dean Martin spiraling out of control afterwards. Yeah, he crashed into a plane on the side of a mountain in California. Yeah. It's overwhelming how creepy it is when it comes to musical celebrities. And that, I wonder if we looked at it across the board, are there TV and movie celebrities that have died the same way? But none seem to really come to mind. But where it comes to musicians, I'd be sweating getting on a plane anytime if I was a musician, just because it seems like every time you turn around, you hear about some death that was associated with a airline.
Yeah. I know there are some movie ones. I mean, I always think of Carol Lombard, Clark Gable's wife, died in a plane crash when she was on a war bonds trip around the country during World War II, because he never really recovered from her death. So that pops into my head. But other than that, you're right. I don't think of as many. I guess because musicians have to tour so much, and where actors really don't. So. Right. And they travel by plane, but they're not forced to.
You got, like you said, Patsy Cline in 63, Ricky Nelson in 85, Leonard Skinnard members.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Steve Gaines and his sister, Cassie Gaines, a backup singer, Otis Redding.
Oh, yeah, Otis Redding, right.
Randy Rhoads in 82.
Yeah.
Will Rogers in 35. How about Reba? I think her band, if I remember correctly, Reba McEntire's entire band died in a plane accident.
No kidding? Wow, I didn't know that.
Tim,
no, I believe you, but yeah, I don't.
It was either a bus crash or airplane.
Oh, no, this is it. 29th anniversary of plane crash. Reba McEntire remembers band members and tour manager.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
On March 16th. Wow. Talk about that timing. March 16th, 1991. 7 members of Reba's entire band and her tour manager, Jim Hammond, were killed near San Diego, California, after their plane crashed into the side of a mountain.
Wow. I wonder why she wasn't on the plane. Makes you wonder. I mean, if she lucked out somehow,
Yeah. And you've got, I'm just looking at this list that popped up, just taking a quick glance at it, because I'm like, maybe I'm just overthinking it. Maybe it's like Buddy Holly, Big Bopper, Richie Valens, 2 or 3 more, and it seems like there's a lot more. But Buddy Holly, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Patsy Cline, Richie Valens, Big Bopper, Leonard Skinnard, Aaliyah, Otis Redding, Ricky Nelson, Jim Croce, the barkeep.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Assassins. I don't know that band, but Passion Fruit, the band died. Glenn Miller.
Oh,
John
well,
Denver.
true. Yeah.
How did we forget John Denver?
Oh, yeah, we did forget about John Denver, didn't we?
Yeah. Jenny Rivera. Those are just the top ones that came up looking at it. And you think, boy, that's, but again, out of the millions of musicians and singers, that's not horrible. I'm sure drugs have taken the lives of many more than that, but it again stands out to you so much.
Yeah, it's, I didn't think about it that way, but you're absolutely right. So.
This message brought to you by FEMA. Home fires occur most often in winter. Keep anything that can catch fire at least 3 feet from heating equipment. And never use an oven to heat your home. Stay in the kitchen when frying, grilling, or broiling food. Turn space heaters off when you leave the room or go to bed. Make sure all vents are clear of snow and ice to allow carbon monoxide to vent outside. Have your furnace, heating system, and chimneys serviced each year by a qualified professional. Learn more at www.usfa.fema.gov. Music, mayhem, magic, murder, death, cults, all kinds of weird stuff. That's what we're talking about today. Troy Taylor's book, A Song of Dance and Death. Magic, murder, mayhem, and the diabolical notes of the devil's music. We have a link to that book on today's program. You can find it, pick it up for yourself. Again, we're just doing kind of a glossary look at a lot of these stories and histories, but folks, there's so much more to examine in these strange deaths and just overall the weird twists of rock and roll history and legends that have existed out there. We've talked about some of the tragedies in the plane accidents, and you talked about some of the early ideas of the devil's music and even some curses. And you mentioned the curse of what is it? The Crossroad Blues?
Yeah.
What other curses jump to mind before we really kind of rack into the 27 Club and some of the other aspects?
Well, I mentioned the Grand Ole Opry curse, and I talked about the Buddy Holly curse. I mean, those are really the big ones. The Crossroad Blues curse is one that's not widely known, but it's one that, once you start putting things together with it, you start to find these different tragedies that are linked with the song. And then after that, you really get into the 27 Club as far as the ones that are the most famous of them. And, as we've already mentioned, we talked about Robert Johnson, and he's sort of the founding member. This is kind of where the lists begin. And there may be other people, further back in history, but as far as recording musicians and things, it really starts with Robert Johnson dying at 27. And again, it's hard to know exactly under what circumstances he died, because it's all pretty mysterious, but that's supposed to be sort of the beginning of the cursed club that no one really wants to be a member of. A lot of times when you see these lists, they jump right to Brian Jones, but there were actually a couple of other 27-year-old performers that died before he did. Jesse Belvin was a rhythm and blues singer. He was known for songs like Earth Angel. You might know that song, or Good Night, My Love. Yeah, he died at 27. in a car crash in 1960, 4 hours after performing in his last concert, and he was 27. 1964, the next on the list was Rudy Lewis. He was a later member of the Drifters. He did not, or actually a little bit earlier member, because he did not perform on Under the Boardwalk, but he did perform on Some Kind of Wonderful and Up on the Roof and a few other things. And he died from a drug overdose, as you'll find that happens quite a bit in this club, unfortunately. But he was 27. And then it goes to Brian Jones, a member of the Rolling Stones, who had a pretty, his life was a kind of a mess. I mean, things were all over the place for him. He'd started the band with, he really started the band, and then he got Mick Jagger and Keith Richards on board, and he sort of lost control of the band because he had really always wanted to do this kind of bluesy thing, which is how they first started. And they took it in another direction and eventually forced him out. But he had a pretty crazy life anyway. A lot of drugs, a lot of women, a lot of children that he didn't claim. I mean, just the life of a 60s rock star, I guess, really is how you would look at it. But he died at 27 at his home. The house that his house had actually been owned by A.A. Milne, the guy that wrote the Winnie the Pooh books. And the woods behind his house were the 100-acre woods from the story.
Oh, wow.
But yeah. So, but he died in his swimming pool. And that's one thing you'll find about all of these, or most of these deaths, not all of them, but a lot of them. You'll find that there are mysterious circumstances involved and a lot of raised questions and a lot of unanswered questions. And he drowned in this pool, believed to be, high, and just, didn't get out of the water and drowned. But then there have been a lot of claims that he was murdered, that there had been someone at the pool that night, some people he'd had a disagreement with, who was doing some work on the house, that they had forced him underwater, and there were eyewitnesses who saw it, and then there weren't. And so there's a lot of questions about exactly how he died. But the main thing is that he died at 27, and that was where it all boiled down to. In 1970, Blind Al Wilson from Canned Heat died, and he died early. But again, it was a case of, I don't know. There's a lot of questions about him as well as exactly what happened. He liked to sleep outside, and that's where he was found. They were getting ready to go on tour the following day, but his body was found in his sleeping bag with a bottle of sleeping pills. Some say he committed suicide. Again, some say it was just an accidental overdose. We'll never know. It's just one of those things that there's no way that we can ever know exactly what happened. And then the next on the list was Jimi Hendrix, who died in 1970, in September of 1970, at his girlfriend's apartment in England. And again, there are all these questions about what happened. He took some of her sleeping pills. Some say he took too many, and he vomited in his sleep and choked to death. Some said it was an overdose, that he was, but there's all kinds of conspiracies. I mean, there are so many conspiracies about Jimi Hendrix's death that some people claim that he was murdered by the FBI. So, because there was a file on him with the FBI and all this stuff. I mean, there's some really crazy conspiracies about Jimi Hendrix. And really, I just think it was either, he took too many. I don't think he did it on purpose. I think it was an accidental death. But whether or not it could be prevented, I think, is whether or not where the big question lies with him. Janis Joplin, always next on the list. She, died of an overdose in Hollywood at her hotel at 27. And this was somebody who had incredible talent, as we all know. I mean, but she also had a very heavy drinking and heroin problem. So, it was, you almost want to say inevitable, unfortunately. But on the other hand, still, she was only 27. And, it's anybody with that kind of talent and had that kind of promise. It's just tragic to see someone die at that age. But, she really kind of lived, I guess you'd say she lived every moment of her life, of her 27 years. But on the other hand, what a tragedy. But she was next on the list. Grateful Dead member Ron Pigpen McKiernan died at 27. And then we start to get into some of the ones that aren't well known, like Pete Ham of Badfinger committed suicide. He hung himself. He was 27. Pete DeFreitas from Echo and the Bunnymen died in a motorcycle accident, so he didn't actually die as so many of the other ones did. Mia Zapata, she was an early part of the grunge movement, and she was in a band called the Gits, quite a few things, but she was murdered in Seattle. So she, again, didn't drink herself to death or die in an accident. She was murdered. And I'm not even gonna, as we segue into Kurt Cobain, let's just leave the whole murdered thing out of it because that seems to be the big question as to what happened there. But as far as really what's commonly believed, Kurt shot himself, and I think that's probably accurate. I always thought at the time, I remember when, it hasn't been that long ago. I remember when all that happened, and it seemed like whenever you heard that Kurt Cobain had killed himself, you kind of went, well, that's, we knew it was coming, but the question wasn't whether he'd do it, it was when, because that seemed like a guy who was on a spiral from as soon as he became famous, So, but there were other people after him, Kristen Pfaff, Richie Edwards from Manic Street Preachers, and there's a lot of people on the list. Amy Winehouse is the most recent member of the 27 Club. She is the one who most people will remember because it just wasn't that long ago. And again, though, but her lifestyle, I'm sure, led to, her destruction because she'd been kind of cruising toward that for a couple of years before it finally happened. So she's the most recent member of the list. And I know that you may be sitting here keeping your own list and wondering why I left one out. Did you notice that there's one missing?
Well, I would say something was knocking on the door of forgetfulness, but I wasn't sure if you were thinking the same guy. Hi, I'm Jim Morrison.
Yeah, I'd leave Jim Morrison off this list because the book delves into the fact that I don't believe he died at 27. So, and I offer all the evidence as to why. So, because I think if anybody could have gotten away with it, it was him, and he desperately wanted to walk away from it all, and I think he pulled it off. That's just my opinion, but I really
can tell you this for what it's worth. I know it's too late for the printing of your book, but do you remember Friday Night Videos when just as MTV was launching?
Yeah.
Cheap version. Friday Night Videos was hosted by Ray Manzarek, who was pretty blotto, if I recall, on his deal. But he made an offhanded comment about Morrison still being alive.
Oh, did he?
And when they replayed it, that part was taken out. I also, I'm friends with a pretty well-known photographer from the 60s. And in one of our first discussions, I just said, so what was it like to work with Jim Morrison? And he actually opened up his portfolio and showed me some really amazing pictures he had that have never been published, right?
Oh, wow, cool.
And this was back in the 80s, and we talked about it, and he said, and he flipped to a picture, and he said, here's one of Jim that I took about 4 years after he was reportedly dead.
Yeah.
And it just broke into a big smile, and I said, what? And he just kind of shrugged and smiled at me, but it looked like an older Jim Morrison, not the big heavy set, like end of his life Elvis, Morrison that we started to see, but he was thinned back out and more mature looking. But that, to me, his comment, and every now and again, I would needle him through the years, and I'm like, were you joking to me about Morrison? And he goes, brother, I'm telling you as plain as day, I saw Morrison riding on his motorcycle. I took a photograph of him. I'm just going to let you, I'm telling you, in my opinion, he did not die when they said he did. And it's interesting in the movie, which I love, Val Kilmer was Jim Morrison.
Oh yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
But I found it interesting the way they end that movie, because it doesn't say Jim Morrison died on September 7th, 1978, or whatever the date was. Right? It's and actually I think that's Keith Moon's death date, if I remember. Yeah. I think he was July 3rd, 71.
July 5th. Yeah, July 5th. Well, yeah. July 2nd. I don't know. See,
but
right in there.
It was in July of 71 that he died. But it says, like at the end, it goes, it is said on July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison died. 2 years later, Pamela joined him.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought, well, that's an interesting way to say that.
Yeah.
Isn't it? And I was fascinated. Do you remember the Eddie and the Cruisers movie?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That seems to be based, right on the
concept. It was. Right.
Story.
Yeah.
The second one, not so great, but the first Eddie and the
Cruisers
one
was really great. Yeah.
So, if I know you don't want to give much away because you put a lot of work into it. But
I don't mind. I don't mind talking about this. I talk about this all the time.
What was one tipping point to you that made you believe that Morrison didn't die?
Well, there were so many. I mean, there were just so many. Nobody really knew what he was doing toward the end of his life. Those last few days were really confusing. I mean, there were a lot of rumors and a lot of stories. But, when his body was found, some people said that he had a heart attack. That was the official cause of death, or that he died of a heroin overdose, which was something he didn't even use. He was a drinker, heavy drinker, didn't use heroin and didn't like needles, so he wouldn't have shot up. Even if he'd snorted it, he still didn't like heroin. But his death certificate was signed by a French doctor that didn't actually exist. That was a good one to start with. But nobody knows exactly where he ended up. When Bill Sidens, the Doors manager, went over to Paris when he got the news that Jim was dead, he showed up on July 6th, which was 3 days later after he had been reported dead. And when he got there to the apartment, Pamela was there, and there was a sealed coffin and that death certificate, and that was it. There was nothing else. He never saw Jim. And before he left L.A., Ray Manzarek had called him and said, "Hey, I need you to be sure." And he said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "And just be sure." Well, he never was sure because he never saw anything. There were only 5 people at his funeral. When he got home and took Pamela back, it was all over. So the only person whose word we had that Jim was dead was Pamela, who would have lied about anything if Jim told her to.
Right.
And he'd been talking about faking his death as far back as 1967, before they were even super famous. His suggestion to the band at the time to try to get some publicity was for him to fake his death. And then after they got famous and he got sick and tired of that pretty quickly, he kept telling his friends that he wanted to get out of it, he wanted to change his life, and that he came up with the name. He said that if anybody at the record company ever got a call from Africa from a guy named Mojo Rising, that it would be him. And you'll remember in L.A. Woman, he repeats Mojo Rising. I mean, I know now we're getting into the Beatles records being played backwards, but so you can leave that out. But he also, one of his ideas for this was one of his favorite poets was Arthur Rimbaud. And he had been fascinated with the idea that Rimbaud had become so famous writing poetry when he was young, and then he disappeared for years, and nobody even knew he was alive until 10 years later, he just sort of showed back up again and died for real pretty young. So I don't know. There's been a lot of stories about it. And like you said, Ray Manzarek even said he used to say that if anybody could get away with it, faking his death, it would be Jim. And I just have always, something that has never set right with me about the whole thing. And, nobody really saw the body. There are no photographs of the body. A doctor that didn't exist is the one who signed the death certificate. And the whole thing just smells. And I've always thought if anybody could do it, it would have been him. And if there was anybody who was reckless and conceited and ego-driven enough to do it, it would have been Morrison. So,
don't hold back. How do you really feel?
I love the guy. No. Don't get me wrong. I love the Doors, and I'm fascinated with Morrison. But I also think that if I had known him in real life, I'm sure I would have thought he was a jerk. Everybody else did. So I'm thinking I probably would have too. So it's not like I worship him, but on the other hand, I do have a lot of respect for him. And I just really think that with his kind of sense of humor and his kind of way of thinking and his sickness with how much he hated what fame had brought him, really, which is why they went to Paris in the first place, to get away from everything, it would have been him. And if it could have been done, he would have done it.
I think you make a compelling argument for it. I'd love to see. I mean, there was a guy, and again, get into some of these weird ass conspiracy deals. There was a rancher who looked an uncanny amount like an older Jim Morrison. that people had uncovered like a decade ago. Do you remember?
I remember that. Yeah, I remember that.
You don't sound like
I wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced. I mean, if it had really been him, it would have been a sensation. It wouldn't have been just some kind of internet thing, which is all it turned out to be. And I just wasn't convinced, because I honestly think, well, by now I think he's probably dead. But if it had been, I just don't think that if he'd done this, that he would ever come back. I don't think he would have ever have said, okay, here I am. It wouldn't have been the Eddie and the Cruisers 2 movie, in other words.
Right.
That would never have happened. He would have went away and never come back, and would have never needed to. So I think that was one of the big reasons why, when that guy kind of came forward, I thought, Morrison would have never have come forward. So I don't see that happening.
Isn't that the beauty of it? If you did and nobody believed you, you kind of made the ultimate deal, right? You hit exactly what you'd always hoped.
I guess you're right. So, good point.
Hey, folks, you've got a lot of time to kill. There's things to do, movies to catch up on. Since we're talking funny conspiracies and music, treat yourself to the movie Bubba Hotep. For those of you listening to the show, you're going to like horror movies anyway. This is a hell of a horror movie. It is a comedy horror movie starring Bruce Campbell as Elvis Presley, the African-American actor Ossie Davis as JFK, and they're living in an old folks' home together, fighting an evil, soul-sucking mummy. And if that's not enough to draw you in, we can't be friends. So please stop listening and don't ever talk to me again. But it is a fun movie, and it's a great concept. Have you seen that one yourself, Troy?
Yeah. Don Coscarelli, the guy who did the Phantasm movies, that's who did it. Yeah,
that's right.
It's a great movie.
Oh, it's
really
it's
fun.
Such a fun, dopey horror movie. But watch it, and it's so well acted, documented, and just having complete balls out fun with the whole concept that Elvis faked his death and had a lookalike sitting in for him for a little bit while he was out just trying to enjoy life. And unfortunately, it was the lookalike that died on the crap, leaving him out in the real world. And then I won't disturb or let you know why Ossie Davis is playing JFK, but it's well worth your investment of time. Trust me, there's a lot of stupider movies that we've talked about on this program that were a true waste of your time. This is a fun movie to catch up on. We have to take a quick break. We'll come back. We've got more to talk about with our guest, Troy Taylor, his book, A Song of Dance and Death, Magic, Murder, Mayhem, and the Diabolical Notes of the Devil's Music. We continue right here on Darkness Radio.
Every 2 minutes, an American is sexually assaulted. Be the someone who gives their time. Be the someone who lends an ear. Be the someone who takes a step. This is Christina Ricci with RAIN, asking you to join the fight against sexual violence and volunteer in your community. Log on to RAIN.org, that's RAINN.org, to learn how you can be the someone.
This message brought to you by the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network and this station.
Babies come with lots of decisions.
Cloth or disposable? Crib or bassinet?
So when it comes to protection, go with the safest, most effective choice, vaccination. Get all the recommended vaccines for your baby by age 2 to protect your child against 14 serious childhood diseases. For more reasons to vaccinate, talk to your child's doctor. Go to cdc.gov/vaccines or call 800-CDC-INFO. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
So I've got to know, Troy, of all the things you write about, what drew your attention to this is a book I want to write about? What specifically to a guy who's into the supernatural and true crime made you kind of bridge so many different aspects into this book?
Well, I mean, the subject matter had all of the things in it that I love music. I'm not a musician, but I do love music, and I love history, and I love music history, and there's plenty of supernatural connections, and of course, as it turns out, there's plenty of true crime in here too, because a lot of these people's lives ended quickly and suddenly and tragically. So you have a lot of mysteries and murders and all kinds of stuff mixed in all of this history of the last, dating back to the 1920s, but really, it's the rock era. It's the 60s and 70s that take up a good chunk of this book, not only the 27 Club, but that's when we really started to see, when there had been church groups and things calling Elvis music devil's music in the 50s. But by the late 60s and into the 70s, musicians really just seemed to kind of be embracing the whole idea of the devil's music. And that's when a lot of things started to get mixed in, and a lot of the musicians would live to regret mixing with, some of the supernatural elements, real supernatural elements that they were portraying in their music. The Rolling Stones dipped their toe into, sympathy for the devil and all that stuff that they did. And a lot of that came from their, connections and friendships with people who were, involved in, all kinds of stuff from, real satanic worship to, putting on the show. And that's really what Mick Jagger was doing with this. It was all part of an act. It was all part of, building an audience. But he got involved with this guy named Kenneth Anger, who was a devotee of Aleister Crowley, who shows up about 422 times in the last half of this book. Crowley just mixes in a lot with the 60s and 70s stuff. It was an era where people were looking back at, especially the British musicians were looking back at some of the black magic things from the turn of the century. And Crowley, of course, was, an integral part of all of that. And Kenneth Anger shows up quite a bit in the book, too. He was a low-budget filmmaker, really, who claimed to be a Satanist. And he really kind of pushed his way into the celebrity crowd of the 60s. He wrote a couple of books that people are familiar with, those Hollywood Babylon books that were big, right. Were going around for a while, coffee table size books just filled with rumors and stories about Hollywood, most of which weren't true, but they were rumors. And he always said, hey, this is gossip. And this is the gossip I wanted. This is the stuff you're not going to find in the gossip pages. And that's what he really became famous for. But he did a number of films, too. He was trying to get a movie made, Lucifer Rising, and he wanted Mick Jagger to play Lucifer in the film. And, things just... After a while, Mick started to realize that this was a bad idea hanging around this guy, because there had been a lot of bad things that had happened, and I don't even know if I'd call them satanic, but I think he started to get nervous as to how much he was going to delve into this stuff. Anyway, Anger ended up getting, and this is kind of a side note, but he ended up getting someone else to play Lucifer, a young guy whose name was Bobby Beausoleil. Who, if you are connected at all or know much about the Manson murders, Bobby was a member of Manson's family and was involved in the Tate and LaBianca murders. So there are a lot of crosses and a lot of connections with a lot of things going on. I did a whole section about not only the Stones, but the Manson murders too, because Manson was a failed musician. That's what he really wanted, was to become a rock star. That's why he palled around and became friends with Dennis Wilson. And, the murders started out to be, revenge, because nobody would give him a record contract. So a lot of the stuff that we know, or we think we know about the Manson murders, it really boils down to not so much some kind of supernatural or, real religious cult. It really is a cult of personality built around Manson and his failure to be a cool musician, which is really what he wanted. So, but you get into that stuff with a lot of these bands, and these are famous bands. Led Zeppelin is probably the most famously connected to supernatural stuff, and that's all because of Jimmy Page, his obsession with Aleister Crowley. So again, we go back to Crowley again, but Jimmy Page was fascinated with the whole idea. He collected Crowley memorabilia. As you mentioned at the very beginning, he bought Crowley's house on Loch Ness and lived there for a while. I mean, there was a lot going on there. What were you going to say? I'm sorry, Dave.
No, I just said, yeah, right.
Yeah. So, didn't he
claim that he was influenced by something magical as well for most of the music that he was writing while he was at Crowley's old home?
Yeah, he talked about that stuff a lot. I mean, to the point that I think the rest of the band started to get a little, a little turned off by the whole thing, because one of the things we see with these bands, and we think of these, this classic Led Zeppelin or somebody like the Eagles or something. A lot of those guys did not get along at all. They worked together, and that was it. And we have this illusion that these bands were these really tight, people who spent all their time together. And in this case, especially with Led Zeppelin, these guys were trying to live their own lives, and all they ever heard about was, how they signed a deal with the devil, and that's how they became famous. I mean, that was a huge story for them, and it went around for years and years. People would say it, and there were people who would swear to it that it was true. That's where their fame and fortune came from, and all of that came because of Jimmy Page's obsession with black magic and Satanists and Aleister Crowley. I mean, that was their whole thing. And there was, they would then again try to keep with the theme of this because it brought them a lot of attention. They used a lot of symbols and stuff, and and then left a lot of questions behind as to what all of it meant, because they wanted to make sure that people were, fascinated with the whole thing. And I don't know if you've ever seen, I always suggest people, if they get a chance, to watch the Led Zeppelin film that was made. The Song Remains the Same. Have you ever seen that? Where no, they have their own, each of the members of the band have their own, it's a music documentary, but then there are like a music video section where they, are allowed to live out their fantasies of, Robert Plant is like a knight on a horse, and that's his sequence. And, of course, Jimmy Page's is very occult. It's a very kind of dark. I mean, it's really pretentious and terrible. But if you like Led Zeppelin, you should watch it sometime if you get a chance. It's just not. It's not what you think it'll be whenever you see it. But it is interesting, and you do kind of see the connections of the occult. And that's where the story kind of skews off, because by the 70s, a lot of these guys were tired of Jimmy Page's, I don't know if you'd say his obsession, but at least his fascination and all the publicity that it had brought to the band started to wear on them a little bit, especially when Robert Plant had a number of tragedies in his life. He had a son who was killed, and he had several things that happened, and the newspapers and the tabloids were all blaming these things on, this satanic force that Jimmy Page had brought to the band. And, it was really starting to irritate them. And a lot of that is what led to their breakup. And, John Bonham then died. And again, then they once again blamed Jimmy Page for all this stuff. And that's kind of what, split them up. It was all this stuff, the pressure of all this stuff, and them getting blamed on because of their deals with the devil and that kind of garbage. Really, is what it boiled down to. It was more of an interest, a fascination, and publicity. Like I was talking about Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. That was something that they put on because it looked cool in the early 80s. It wasn't because it was real. I mean, there were other people that were actually, trying to sell their image on actual black magic. There was a band called Coven that claimed to be witches, and but most people never heard of them. They only put out 2 albums. So the real thing didn't work. But put up Motley Crue, put up a pentagram on the cover of your Motley Crue album, people are going to buy it, because you're flirting with danger and not necessarily embracing it. And I think that that's sort of what turned most of the band off in Led Zeppelin. And I think that's one of the things that led to them going their separate ways.
Seeing the bands that tried to embrace the dark side and play with that aspect, even the Beatles on their
Sgt. Pepper's
album, they were originally going to have the devil on the cover somewhere. I think they have Anton LaVey, don't they?
No, they have Aleister Crowley.
Crowley, that's
Crowley on the cover. Yeah.
But of all the really weird people, this has been one that I've heard for a long time. I'm wondering if you can clarify this. Sammy Davis Jr., born a Christian, becomes a Jew, and then right, because he switches over to Judaism, and then he actually flirted with Satanism for a while, and I heard that he and Sinatra kind of had a falling out about that. As a matter of fact, the old legend lore is that during that time is when they were filming the movie Ocean's 11. And he was going to leave him out. And then he said, fine, I'll put you in the movie, Sam. And he made Sammy Davis Jr. the garbage man. And he gave him a few lines and not much to do. But is there any real information that you were able to uncover that the Candyman was actually part of Satanism at all?
Yes.
Really?
The answer is yes. Okay, so here's the thing. When Anton LaVey started the Church of Satan on April 30th of 1966, his idea of Satanism is not like what you'd see in I'm trying to give you a comparison that people would know. And I mean, most people have probably not seen a movie like The Devil Rides Out. It's an old horror film. But it was not Satanism of Anton LaVey was never really about worshiping the devil. I mean, all of the things that he did, the pentagrams and the shaved head and the cloaks and all that stuff was all, those were the trappings. Those were the fixtures. His Satanism was about doing whatever you wanted to do as long as you didn't hurt other people, not listening to rules made up by other people. As long as you weren't hurting anyone, you could do anything you wanted to. So he ripped off the Aleister Crowley, do what thou wilt. And that was, that's the whole of the law. That's kind of what it became. So he attracted, when that started in the 60s, he attracted a lot of interest from, at the time, maybe somewhat fading celebrities like Jane Mansfield. She was deeply involved for a number of years with LaVey and the Church of Satan before her death. And Sammy Davis Jr. became a member of the Church of Satan. But you also have to understand that people who attended his ceremonies and his meetings, it was like a party. It wasn't, they weren't sacrificing children or anything or goats or anything else. It was usually just a case of getting a bunch of women to lay naked on an altar so that they could serve, wine off the top of them. I mean, these were parties. And there were guys like Ray Bradbury and Forrest Ackerman, the guy that started Famous Monsters. Sure. I mean, These were guys who hung out with him, who went to his parties because it was the in thing to do at the time. So just because Sammy went to the parties, it didn't, he joined the church, and I've got some photographs of him with Anton LaVey that they took together at some of the parties and things, but it was more of a case of, it was a cool thing to do, man, So, yeah, but it is true that he did get involved, and Frank, who was a devout Catholic. It's just like the way how angry he was with Mia Farrow when she did Rosemary's Baby. It was the same kind of thing. He was mad at Sammy for getting involved with LaVey at all. It's the Church of Satan, as far as it went with Anton LaVey and thing, is it was never really meant to be anything scary. It was more of, he loved attention. He loved publicity, and he really loved, the shock effect of what he was doing. And it was a time in American pop culture when, horror films and things were turning to the occult. You had The Exorcist, you had Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, all that stuff was popular around that time. And he was part of that cycle. And it was, the trappings of all of it was the shock factor. But I think he was a guy who had a really good sense of humor and really took a lot of pleasure in, messing with people. But if you go and read, and then this will sound crazy because I'm not, but if you go and read some of his writings, he really had some really astute things to say. And his rules were a lot kinder than, how to be one of the, in part of his group, were a lot kinder than you might find in your local church. It was all about like helping people and being decent to people, and that is what's going to make, that's what's going to give you good things. If you're a decent person who doesn't hurt people, but if you want to, go out with, 4 women, you can, as long as nobody gets hurt out of it. It was a product of the times. But yeah, Sammy was involved. So you're right about that.
Well, and again, when you think, and this is just broad stroking, when you think devil worshippers in music, right? You might think Rob Zombie, Marilyn Manson, right. Even those diabolical knights in Satan's service known as Kiss. That was the big thing right. When I was a kid growing up. I loved Kiss, man. I was a part of the Kiss army, and my friend's mom was like, oh, that stands for Knights in Satan's service. And that, I got to be honest with you, I was a Christian kid, but that was alluring. I'm like, they're what?
Sure.
And
sure. And it wasn't true, but still.
Right.
Yeah.
The cover of Destroyer, where they're standing there kind of frolicking over flames and the women reaching up out of the, oh, yeah, that's what she was telling. This is hell. This is, and I was like, what? This is, oh, I want to know more. Even though it wasn't about the demonic side, it was just that enticement. But when I think of dark side and I think of evil and true Satanists, there's only one name that leaps to mind. Liberace.
Right.
What the hell? Is he really a Satanist as well?
I don't know about that one. I hadn't heard that. But it was the same time period. So I mean, he certainly could have attended some of the same parties. But yeah,
well, one of the things that popped up was. Wow! I looked this up a while ago because I have an article about strange connections in Hollywood. That's where I knew about Sammy. Liberace was according to the article, was one of the earliest members of the Church of Satan, and he was a very close friend of Anton LaVey. How just funny, right? But you just think of all funny the world for Liberace to be one.
A lot of for you and I both, a lot of our imagery and things we think about with Satanists and things come out of when we were in school. I mean, because I think you went to school in the early 80s too, right? You were in school. Yeah. So that's what we heard about was that, if you played records backward, there were satanic messages. There were Satanists everywhere, the Geraldo specials and things. And it was this diabolical, evil underground that was kidnapping children and committing murders. And, all this stuff came out of this repressed memory stuff that was popular at the time, where people were having these memories of, being in bed and their parents coming in with all their country club friends wearing black robes and forcing them to have babies and using them for sacrifices. And, all of it turned out to not be true. But that
satanic panic.
Right, exactly. That's exactly it. And it bled over into music heavily, which is why guys like Motley Crue and Ozzy Osbourne, they were taking advantage of the press around this stuff and putting out records that our parents didn't want us to listen to, because they were satanic, even though they really weren't. And these guys were about as far from Satan or what was being portrayed as Satanists at the time as you could possibly imagine. But it did put, an image in our heads, and it affected a lot of people, especially like fundamentalist Christians who believed what they were hearing on the radio or believed what they saw in the Geraldo special about Satan, the satanic underground and things. And that really colored a lot of the last part of this book, because that's what we were dealing with when I was a teenager. That's the kind of atmosphere that everything had secret messages in it. And if you played them backwards, you would hear things, and, or these songs had secret meanings, they were putting everybody into that category. And it was a crazy time. It was a really crazy time to be a kid. And that was the stuff we had to deal with at the time, and trying to listen to music we wanted to listen to have your records confiscated by people because they were satanic. I mean, bands like Styx, it's like, come on, I mean, give me a break, but there's a lot of that,
With that said, we have one of the darkest foes walking amongst us still today, still out touring with his demonic little partner, Daryl Hall.
Oh, right.
You got into that, I guess, from, again, with the articles and stuff I was reading into when I was trying to figure all this out. He was big into it in his solo album. They said he references Aleister Crowley through a couple of the songs. He believed that his great-grandfather was a warlock. Okay. And he actually talks about it in an interview that he did. But that he believed he was a warlock or of warlock blood. It's funny to me. Again, people you think, I'm just waiting for John Tesh's name to get thrown out there, right? Or Jan, which Jan would make sense. Then we'd know how he got Linda Evans in the 80s, right?
Right, yeah.
Very strange. Does it surprise you? I mean, I guess I should rephrase the question. Of the work and research you did, what aspects of this did surprise you, or names, or people associated?
Wow. Gosh, not a lot. I don't think I got a lot of surprises out of it. I think but some of the stories or some of the connections that I didn't realize existed, some of those were weird. When you got into, like all the stories that David Bowie used to tell about how he was a magician and he was apparently at war for a while with someone. And I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Jimmy Page. That they were having a warlock war for a while between each other. Of course, that was the story. And then Bowie used to, he was on some diet where he only drank champagne and snorted Coke, and that was his diet. And he would do that for weeks at a time. And then his ex-wife, Angie, we talked about this time when he claimed that there was a demon in their swimming pool and all this stuff. I'm just thinking, wow. I think I probably would too if that was my diet, if that's what I was functioning on. So some of the stories had to be included because they were just so weird and so funny. But yeah, I don't know. I would have been surprised if I had run across the Liberace thing. That would have surprised me. Yeah. It surprised me when you just told me. So. But yeah, there's, a lot of this stuff, it just, as you start to find just how deep it goes into, and how much of it turned out to be just rumors, a lot of this stuff did. Because while Jimmy Page was, fascinated with all this stuff, there were a lot of things said about the band and something that didn't happen or weren't for real. And when you find out that Mick Jagger was terrified of all this stuff, even though he was, putting on the show, but once it started to get real, he got out of it quickly, So it's interesting to find some of the personalities and things involved, and who did what and who didn't do what, and it was a fun book to research. It was a fun book to write, and every once in a while there are books that I'm sorry that I finish, because they're just so much fun to work on that you hate to be done with them, and this was one of them. This was one of those books I'd been talking about writing for a few years. And I finally got around to it. It was on my bucket list. And then by the time it was done, I was like, oh, man, wait, maybe I should dig up some more. No, you're good. So sometimes you just have to know when to quit.
Well, people don't realize, too, the connection to music and the supernatural, how powerful it really is. In some of the first recordings ever made, that's where we started getting EVP, wasn't it? The guy trying to record bird sounds. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his name is eluding me right now, but was it Rodive?
Jorgensen. Frederick Jorgensen, I think. Yeah, he was an opera singer. Yeah.
And they would record, and all of a sudden they would have these strange voices appearing on recording that they could make no sense of. So it's been a part of it, and talking to musicians throughout the years, in private and on public and on the radio, it's so interesting how many of them feel as though they are connected to something supernatural when they're writing, and how stuff happens to them at times.
Right, and the way music plays such an important role in ceremonies and services. Whether or not, I guess you could put religion into a supernatural category, but any kind of ceremony has to involve music, and that's where people believe that the spirits, whether it's a seance has always had music. And people believe that it makes things easier. Voodoo ceremonies, it's all about the drums and the rhythm. Same way with like a Pentecostal church. If you believe in that sort of thing, when people become possessed by the spirit at a Pentecostal church, it's because they've been worked up by drums and pianos and everything else for a half an hour. So music is super involved with the supernatural and always has been. So, I took a look at kind of the darker side of it with this book, but it plays a role on both sides of the supernatural, both the light and the dark side of it, and they're always going to be linked.
What can you tell us? What are some of the before we let you off the hook here too early? What are some of the creepier aspects that you uncovered in the book?
Well, most of that stuff had to do with. Most of it I found creepy in we get into the 60s and you get into some of these stories about some of the bands, especially with the Rolling Stones, because they, especially Mick, really kind of embraced this stuff at first. He got scared because of some of the things that were happening with Kenneth Anger, who was a weird dude anyway. And I think that for the most part was at the time was completely full of crap about most of the things he claimed he could do, but he knew how to manipulate people, and he knew how to make them believe that what he was doing was real. And I think that some of that stuff and some of the things that they reported, and some of their crew, a lot of the times it wouldn't be Mick who would tell the story, but it'd be somebody, a member of the band or somebody who was part of the crew or one of the managers or something would talk about, they were at this party, and he was at a party, and the Stones were there, and he said that he saw Kenneth Anger at the party, and he went to talk to him, and then he couldn't find him. And then it turned out that Anger had been in another country at the time of the party and had shown up, a week or so later. And this guy was positive that he had seen him at the party that night, and Anger claimed that he had dropped in. Now, whether or not he was lying or not, these people, they all believed it. And I found that some of that stuff was really creepy. And some of the things that they would get involved with, the accidents that took place, the bad luck they started to have when they started to try to push this guy out of their lives, and that was some weird stuff. It really was. And even just getting back into some of those curses and stuff, and when I was laughing about, some of them are a stretch. You really have to use your imagination to turn them into something other than coincidence. But on the other hand, like we said, so many people dying at the same age, but it wasn't even so much that. The Grand Ole Opry thing really is freaky, and it really freaked out a lot of people at the time. And why that particular, there's nothing about the building that is the curse, but whatever was going on was happening to performers who performed there. And the list of the people who died is even longer than most of the other curses in the book, because they lived so, some of them lived tragic lives or live hard, die young kind of lives, but some of them didn't. And they were still kind of caught up in this, burned to death in their trailers and, killed in car accidents lifestyle. It makes you wonder if, when you finish this book, it sometimes makes you wonder if all the fame and fortune is worth it, with a lot of these cases. And when you get into the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner and stuff, and you question, what's happened to some of those people. I mean, some of them ended up in mental hospitals and, in early deaths. And you're thinking, was it really worth it? Was it worth it? I don't know. So I don't know. It makes you think, but on the other hand, it's a lot of fun. We'll go with that. Okay.
Well, and, it looks as though, when you dig through some of these stories that musicians have found inspiration in many places. Sometimes the darker parts of culture is a way to examine who we are as humans. You can't always just talk about love and light and romance. And, sometimes it's in that darker underbelly that the most fascinating characters will spring to life in musical songs. And I understand to a degree why you've got bands like Motley Crue and Judas Priest and Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath and things that are trying to draw the attention almost in the same way that LaVey was doing, right? Look, we're going to throw something flashy at you. You're going to look in mock horror and astonishment, but you might learn something. Yeah. You might read and see in the liner notes something else. And I know David Lee Roth, I just listened to an entire book called Running with the Devil on Van Halen. But David Lee Roth had made comments about feeling influenced by demons at points in life. And that I don't recall that in the book, but I remember reading about that in a few of the articles. Now, again, are they misquoting and, sure. Is this becoming a, we're bigger than Jesus thing like John Lennon and the Beatles and being totally misconstrued? I'm not certain. But, when exploring these different facets of music, it's not surprising. And I got to tell you, I'm in no way, shape, or figuratively or anything, a fan of the devil himself. The song Sympathy for the Devil, though, is a fascinating song.
It is. It is.
Giving that other concept and looking in the examination of why we believe this is good and that's bad. What really is the devil and what where does it live?
And maybe that's it. Maybe it's in those pockets in between, the places where, we subjectively input our own thoughts. That's where the devil lives. By reading into something that isn't there, that's giving the devil power.
Right. True. That's absolutely true. I wrote a whole massive book on the devil. And, by the time I was finished it, I had convinced myself that the devil is us, that we are what gives power to anything bad that happens. The same way you just said it. I mean, I think it's what we allow to happen, what we bring into things is the evil that men do. But, on the other hand, there's a couple of famous quotes where it says, who knows who the devil is? It's hard to say because God has all the best books. So we don't ever get his side of the story. So, yeah, I don't know, man. The stuff is fascinating, and it does make you think that there's something out there that influences things. But definitely with music, it was a fun book to write. So that's where we ended up.
Very cool. As we go out, let's wrap up with one other aspect. I mean, right now, above all, witchcraft. True witchcraft, Wiccan, and that environment seems to have regained a new footing and popularity as a religion. And, one of the most outspoken people in this field seems to be Stevie Nicks with this. Now, do you know much about that? I mean, was this something that was more of a fascination or what?
Yeah, I didn't. And that was funny because I didn't include her in the book because I really like Stevie Nicks, and she has really kind of embraced that whole thing, the white witch thing, with American Horror Story and stuff, and plays on a character. But she has always said she's always maintained she's not really a witch. And because of the interviews she kept giving, and I kept finding more and more of them in her own words, I decided I would not include her in the book just because it seemed like something that she was saying she wasn't. So why are we still calling her one, even though that seems to be a persona that she created, much like Mick Jagger did, with this satanic thing, even though he wanted nothing to do with it. So that's why I didn't include her, because I think that while supernatural, the kind of witchcraft or like Wicca that has become a popular thing again, I don't know if I would consider it to be something supernatural because of the things more about nature and the natural world than it does in creating magic. Although there seems to be 100 variations of that too, and a lot of it, unfortunately, I find that even back in the 60s, when all of the witchcraft stuff really got popular. In the first place, there were a lot of people out there claiming to be witches who really weren't, because it's great to get attention that way. It's kind of like rock stars saying that they're Satanists, So I don't know, but I did leave her out. But that's why, is because she repeatedly said she wasn't a witch. So there you go.
Good enough for me. Good enough for you. A song of dance and death, magic, murder, mayhem, and the diabolical notes of the devil's music. Can I ask you real quickly before we do head out? There is that what is that set of notes that's played that they actually think evokes ghost communication?
It is called the tritone. It was a certain interval in music, and it was the augmented fourth interval of the tritonus. That was what it was called. And I'll just read you from a note here. The tritone was defined as a musical interval composed of three adjacent whole tones. One specific kind of tritone, the augmented fourth interval, spans across three whole steps in the scale. Before composers began using major and minor scales, this interval was considered so unnatural it was named the devil's interval. And it was actually believed it could summon the devil. But it is it's the opening notes to Purple Haze. That is exactly what that is. The fourth augmented interval. That's it. So when you hear that beginning of how it takes off, that's what that is. Or an example of it.
Is it the tritone too? Is that the one that was banned by churches?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, they were not allowed to use that in any written music at the time and played in a church because it was believed that it would summon the devil because of that delay.
Wow. Very strange.
I had to learn. I don't know anything about writing music or sheet music or anything. So I had to have a crash course in it to write that section of the book, because I had no idea what it was talking about. I had to find examples so that when I heard it, then I would understand it. And because I honestly did not know what it was. So interesting. It did turn out to be interesting. So so I do learn things working on this stuff. So
very cool. Well, the book, there's a link for it. We have a link to Troy Taylor's website on today's show. Troy, thanks again, man. It was great catching up with you, and let's do it again soon.
Yep, sounds good. All right, take care, guys.
Thank you, folks. That's it for this week. We are done. We'll be back with you Tuesday. More of the best in true crime talk radio next week, and more of the best in paranormal talk radio. And please, in this time, if I could just make a quick plea to you, folks. This could be a time of darkness and a time of panic and a time of worry, or we could all look at the chance that we have been given this chance to come back together as a people and a community. And I hope that you'll take this time to reintroduce yourself to your family, to your children, to your parents, to your brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, and get to know one another. I think it's an important part in our history, and this could be what separates us. It's not this hit and this massive impact of a virus that's going to define our future. It's how we come back out of it that will. And let's come back out of it better. Let's come back out of it more in touch with our family and friends, less associated with our electronics and our communication and texting to people that are millions of miles away, when there are people right within the four walls of our own homes that probably know us less than those people that you chat with every day. Take this time to reconnect with yourself and with the people in your home. All right? I hope that you'll consider doing that. Be safe. Be kind to yourselves and one another. We'll be back again next week with more of the best in paranormal talk radio. That's Tim. I'm Dave. This is Darkness Radio.